Welcome to Privacy Piracy. I am really thrilled today. We have a wonderful techie coming to us all the way from Romania. And so you're going to be meeting and learning a lot about all sorts of ways of authenticating and protecting software and all the things that we all worry about, but we have no idea and we don't understand about. So we're going to be talking with Laurentiu Spilca, and he is, as I said, coming to us from Romania, and he is a trainer at Endava. So I'm going to just have him right now tell us a little bit more about his background, and then we'll get started. So tell us, Laurentiu, how did you get to be such a techie?
Hi everyone, thank you very much, Mari, for inviting me. Yes, how did I become a techie? This is a very long story actually. I'm working as a software developer and a trainer for more than 10 years now. And I really liked this kind of computer science and everything since forever. When I was in high school, I actually borrowed my first technical book and I started studying it. And first of all, I started with PHP, which was a language of that time. And now it's less used than it was at that time. But then I moved to Java, and soon I met a lot of frameworks and interesting stuff about the Java ecosystem in general, like Spring and Spring Security, which is the topic of my first book, actually, Spring Security in Action. I met a lot of people who helped me learn things, and becoming a techie, it wasn't only a thing that I decided. It was something I've been dragged into through the interaction with other people and other awesome developers that I met throughout this more than 10 years. I'm working as a software developer and a trainer.
Wow. So how did you start at Endava, and what do they do?
So Endava is an outsourcing company in software development. I'm working there as a development lead. So I'm a software developer and I'm also a trainer. What I try to do is not only do my best into implementing applications, but also sharing knowledge with people inside the company, but also outside the company. So I'm delivering presentations, and I'm writing books, and I'm writing articles, and you can find me online also on my YouTube channel. And that's because I consider that in this domain, it's not only relevant to implement quality software, but also share your knowledge with others. And that's because things change very fast in IT in general and in software development, and we won't actually do a good job if we wouldn't continuously learn. So continuous learning is what I consider to be the main thing a software developer does, and the code that they write is only as a result of what they learn. So in my overview, what the software developer mainly does is learning, and then the software is a consequence of what they learn.
Yeah. And so you're in Romania, but you probably interact with people all over the world in terms of security and software development, right?
Yes, definitely. So I've been working mostly with different companies from both Europe and US. And security has always been one of the main concerns of all the companies and throughout all the software I've been working into. And that's because people start to realize more and more the importance of security. What could happen if you don't have a secure software? If you don't have a secure software, you could lose money, you could lose your brand image and so on as a company. It's very relevant to make sure that your users' data is safe and nobody can alter it or steal it, see it if they don't have the right to do so.
Right, right. And in this country, and I don't know so much about, I would imagine even the European Union, there can be actions, legal actions against companies that don't protect the security and the privacy of the people. So that's really important on all ends for the user and for the company itself. So, so yeah, so you have this new book called Spring Security in Action, and that came out, and then you're writing another book as well. So tell me, first of all, how is it that you decided to write this book?
So I decided to write the book because, as I said, I always believed that sharing knowledge is really important in general, and especially in our domain where things change pretty fast. So one of the main ways people learn is reading books. Fortunately, still reading books. And of course, we have other ways of learning as well, like we have tutorials, we have videos we share, and so on, articles that we read. But still, books and reading books is one of it, it's still one of the first main ways people use and developers use to learn. So I decided to write this book when I've seen that this is something missing, of course, in terms of what people should learn and what's important. And I wanted to mainly help other people learn essential things that they will use then in their work.
So let's talk about, so what is Spring Security?
Spring Security is what we call an application framework that helps us secure our apps. We actually use Spring Security to implement authentication and authorization. Authentication is the process where the application finds out who you are, and authorization is always after authentication, and it's where the application tells you what you can do based on who you are. So once the application finds out who you are, it tells you what's your privileges.
Right. So first they have to figure out who you are, which can be the biggest challenge, right? So that also leads to issues with passwords, which I know in your book you talk a little bit about passwords with regard to authentication. For many of us, passwords are such a hassle. I know I use a password manager, LastPass. And so, what do you think about passwords? I mean, some people have stickies all over the place or have a book with other passwords. I mean, for me, it would drive me crazy. So I use LastPass. How safe is using LastPass?
Yeah, so unfortunately, managing passwords is indeed one of the most difficult things to do. And as a normal end user, having access to many websites, because nowadays we have access to many websites, and we have credentials for all of them. People either tend to use very simple passwords, and that's really a problem because very simple passwords can very easily be broken. Either they tend to use the same password everywhere, and if they use the same password everywhere, it's again a problem, because if you have 10 websites and you use one password, then somehow that password leaks, then some hacker or bad intentioned individual that steals that password can then break into all those 10 other websites. That's again a problem. And neither leaving your passwords everywhere is, even if you use a different password for any website, but if you just have a sticker on your computer with the password, then somebody who visits you can see that and they can use that then I know, to access some information that you wouldn't like to be accessible to everyone. And that's only from the user side. But of course, in the process of authentication, you don't only have the user side, you also have the server side, or basically the company with the against which you authenticate. And there's where you also need to be sure that you have the proper security, and that website or whatever that is secure your credentials properly. Because when you enter your password, you enter it as a plain text. If you have a password 12345, which is of course not good because
Right.
it's a weak
Right.
password. Yeah, but say you have that, even though it would be a strong password, if that's stored at the server side, not encrypted anyhow, then somebody else can break into that website and steal the password. And even if you have a strong password, then it doesn't really matter, because if you use it on 10 different websites, if one of them, only one of them, doesn't secure it, then and it can be stolen, then it can be reused for all the others. So it's definitely not a good idea to reuse your password, because you then have to really trust all the websites you use the password that password for. And you can't necessarily do that. I mean, maybe you can, but generally it's not advisable that you do.
Yeah. That's why I use a password manager, because I can't remember everything, but I don't want to use the same password because enough. I know enough to know that that's very dangerous, like what you're talking about. So, and I don't use the same password for everything. And especially, for anything financial or anything with sensitive data, I want to make sure that I use a different password. So, yeah. So how many, I usually have like, there's like 12 letters, characters that I would never be able to remember. It has to be in my password manager.
Yes.
So on the server side though, on the other side, um, if someone would get my password, even has 12 numbers, letters, and characters, I mean, they could use that, but they would only be able to get into one thing. They couldn't get into something else, which would
Exactly.
be the biggest issue would be is if they got my master password for LastPass. That would be the biggest. So do you use a password manager yourself?
Yes, I do use a password manager, and in order to explain what's this thing with the password manager. So the idea is that you have a master password, as you said, and that's only known by you and the system you use your password manager in. So even if you have, for example, only one password, it's only known by one place that only you have access to, and that's definitely only you have access to. So imagine it's your phone or your computer. It's very probable and most probable that only you have access, and it's very, very limited access to that specific device. But you can't compare that with what happens on a server side, because on a server side, well, it's thousands of people having access to, because you and many others access the web pages of that same application. So you use whatever website you are thinking of, you and maybe thousands or even millions others use those servers.
Mm.
Unlike what happens with your local computer, where it's only you basically using that local computer, and maybe you have, I don't know, somebody else at home using it, but it's still a very, very limited access. So your master password, it can't be stolen, or it's less likely to be stolen, unlike all the other passwords that you use on several other websites.
Right, because they're on
Uh,
other computers, right?
yes.
Right. So so when you're talking about Spring security, what is different in Spring security that is not in what other types of security? Can you kind of differentiate for us?
Spring Security basically is a framework that allows us, the developers, to implement authentication and authorization. It doesn't bring something new in terms of security, but it allows us to implement faster any kind of known way to secure properly your application. So why do we use Spring Security on the server side and similar frameworks is because it takes less time for us. First of all, it takes less time for us to implement some known practices to make sure that your passwords and your data in general is stored securely. And secondly, because it's a framework and it's used by many applications, it makes sure that, or at least we the developers are sure that if we use that to implement the security on the application level side with it, it's less probable that it contains vulnerabilities because it's used by a very big number of applications. So if it would have vulnerabilities, they would have been already discovered by yeah it's most probable that they would have been already discovered. So we know that using a framework like this one is actually very secure, and we know that we use the last practices in terms of securing your passwords and data.
Right. So does it also let you know if there's been a breach of security? Is that built into this Spring Security?
Yes, for any kind of software and any kind of dependency, how we call it, not only Spring Security, but absolutely any kind of dependency, when some kind of breach is discovered, we have different websites and different triggers that tell us when the specific vulnerability has been found. So when something like that happen, teams that of course they take into consideration the proper practices, and hopefully most of the teams do that. We are immediately informed by these breaches, these vulnerabilities, and we, of course, if it's needed, we correct the code behind, and we make sure that we take out that vulnerability from the application so that the data remains secure.
Is there some kind of an alarm that goes off that lets you know that there's a breach, or you have to use it with different applications for you to kind of like, I mean, it seems to me that, as a layperson, when we hear about all these security breaches, sometimes the company doesn't know about it for months. So that's what I'm questioning. Is there something that alerts you early? I'm thinking about Equifax with that huge security breach. There's so many of them. There's been literally thousands of them. How does Spring Security let you know early on? Like, it's like if I have a house alarm, as soon as somebody tries to get in a window or a door, there's an alarm. Is there something like that for a security breach?
So yeah, this is an excellent question. There are mechanisms that allow you know when your application uses something that is not secure. But unfortunately, exactly like an alarm system in your own house, if you don't install it, or if you don't install it properly, then you don't know which are the problems. So what happens in a lot of cases, very often, is that developers either don't install at all an alarm system, or they don't install it properly, and then they of course don't find these problems in time, and they find it only when it's too late, like when somebody already managed to steal the data or modify it. And unfortunately this still happens, but probably with time. And what we do now is learning practices, and basically that's why me and others written books about it, and we are continuously trying to deliver information to make sure that teams in general and as fast as possible will learn all these security practices. And with this, there will be less and less chances that someone would find vulnerabilities in apps.
Right. I think that's the big thing that everybody worries about because we hear about that all the time. So what about security versus privacy? They say that you can have security without privacy, but you can't have privacy without security. So, being coming from having a privacy background, worrying about, someone may get my credentials, but they're really not me, identity theft or some other issues. Uh, how do you deal with the privacy versus security issue?
This is also a very good question. So what happens in software is that sometimes, and yeah, let's say in general, software deals with data and it takes data from the user, and some of that data is what we call private data. So it's your phone number, maybe your email address, maybe even more private data like pictures, whatever documents you store. You don't want someone else to see them unless they have your approval, and that's privacy. Now, security is basically giving you the privilege to allow someone to see that data and or maybe change it, or allowing only yourself to do that. So privacy is making sure that your data is only seen and modified by yourself, the owner of the data, or by someone else who is allowed by you to do that.
Right, consent.
Yes.
Yeah. And I know in the European Union, it's affirmative consent. And here it's always sometimes, opt in, opt out, that kind of a thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the EU basically introduced this GDPR a couple of years ago, and that's where they introduced this consent legislation.
Right. So I noticed you've got a piano back there and a
Yeah,
guitar. So that's for, I guess if you're a real techie, it's kind of a right brain thing, right? For your special. So tell us about your being a musician too.
I like to play my guitar and my piano to get a little bit relaxed when I finish the work, because writing code and thinking about different issues, which might be security related, performance related, sometimes business related, it's quite difficult. I have to be honest with you, it's not easy. And one of the things I found out they work pretty well for me to relax is playing music. Music is difficult itself, so reading a music sheet like those ones behind me and playing them on the piano or on the guitar is not easy, but it's something else. It somehow helps your left side of the brain by working your right side of the brain. So yeah, that's how
A
it
little
works.
balance, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it really helps me chill after a hard working day, and that's why I'm doing that.
No, it's wonderful. Yeah. So let's talk about the difference between software security and hardware security. Can you kind of explain that to us? Are both needed and all that?
Security is what we call it implemented on layers. This is the application is basically the last layer. So when you got into the application, that's the castle that holds the treasure. Uh, Before the application, you have the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is the computers on that execute the application, and the computers themselves they work inside the network, and the network is secured as well. So you have different layers, and each of the layer has its own practices for securing the data. Once you get from the network into the system, then you still have to bypass the system to get into the application. and then you got into the application, you still have to bypass the application to find the data or change the data. So it's not that easy. But still, yeah, each of the layer has its own breaches. So sometimes it happens that different bad intentioned individuals manage to get their hands on the data if you don't follow the practices.